All right. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about what is computer security. So this sounds like a very vague and large topic, and obviously it is. So there's only so much we're going to cover. But to really frame this, what I want to talk about is failures. So this is the famous Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which was an example, right, of where engineers designed a system that wasn't really designed for the environment that it actually was going to run in. And part of that was not knowing, some of the characteristics of what the environment was. So it wasn't necessarily that everyone was negligent in what they did, but the point is people were still hurt, or there was still a risk to people's life at least, right? So in that case, I think there was enough, information ahead of time about it, but there's lots of other engineering failures that have resulted in harm to people. So what you're trying to do is always prevent harm to people, always design your system not to just be as cheap as possible or anything like that, but to understand what the threats are, to understand what risks could exist out there. In these systems, right, we have computer systems that are directly tied to people's lives. So you can think about medical systems. You can think about stuff that's like in cars, stuff that's in automobiles, air traffic control. So there's lots of systems that are critical, super safety critical, and sort of cannot fail. We also have a lot of systems that maybe are less directly tied, but still do a huge amount of damage. So if you think about people's credit card information, account information being leaked, if your identity is leaked, there's a huge amount of harm that can come to you, and this could directly ruin people's lives. It could at least cause a huge amount of hassle, but it could do quite a bit more than that. So you really have a duty to understand what the level of protection is needed. So a good way to understand that is to actually look at failures that have happened in computer security in the past. And I'm going to go through not necessarily just some of the most well-known. I'm going to cover some of the ones that you might have heard about or will come across in any sort of reference to this, but I'm going to cover a few other ones too. There's a huge number of topics that I can't look through, so we're just going to sort of pick a few that I think are particularly interesting or have some good characteristics that are worth talking about. Okay, so let's look at sort of the beginning. So here it is. It's the late 80s, around 1986. I think this starts to happen. There's a 75-cent error in the amount of money that should be applied to this computer account. So at the time, right, these computing systems were really expensive to run. And basically what you had is that all of these systems, all the users of the systems, the time was logged to the cent, or to the second, sorry. And the time being logged to the second meant it was charged to some account. If you were a grad student, your supervisor, he'd have an account that this was charged to, for example. So it was very odd. It was almost impossible to have this discrepancy. And in digging into it, what Clifford Stole discovered was that, in fact, there was someone who had special access to this machine, and the special access let them create an account that wasn't actually associated with a billing account either. So they had a computer account, but no associated billing account, which shouldn't happen, can't happen. And this led to this huge chase, basically, to figure out who this person was. How did they get in, all this stuff. There's a pretty cool, so I linked below this YouTube, so this is a documentary on it, that, let's see, the KGB, The Computer and Me, so it's got lots of really great late 1980s action that you can check out, so highly recommend it. It's got a lot of pretty interesting stuff about this exact topic, but the short summary of it, so what did this result in? What did this kind of initial hacker thing? So it was a huge project to catch them, and Clifford basically spent a huge amount of time on this. And it was really, a sort of an interesting, game to him in some way that made him spend that much time. Because at first the FBI didn't care, right? There's no money. No, 75 cents was stolen, maybe, is all he could really claim at the time. And basically, it was convincing the FBI this was an issue. This was kind of before computer crimes were really a thing, let's say. And the attacker actually was accessing tons of other systems. And most of these systems had like default or no password. So they were just using like manager as username password, stuff like that. This was at, and they were targeting government, Department of Defense, everything like that to try to find interesting information to steal. Part of the other thing they set up was what we call a honeypot now. So at the time, again, this was also, a lot of this was pretty revolutionary. It wasn't really, done before. They basically set up a fake project with a fake secretary and a fake everything to get the hacker to download these fake documents about some secret project the university was going to be helping work on. And as part of that, the hacker eventually kind of reached out to try to get additional information. They finally caught someone in West Germany for this, and again, it took some convincing about this actually being a crime. And they were actually stealing the information and selling it onward to the KGB. So in this case, there was a direct monetary gain that the hacker was trying to get by stealing the information and selling it to the KGB. If we jump forward quite a bit, so if we go to 2001, this is another case, and I referenced this before. This is part of the reason I bring it up. It's not a huge case, but what happened is, so I had mentioned about Dmitry here, who had wrote this advanced ebook processor. And so this advanced ebook processor was basically removing some security from the mechanism for books. And if you remember from the previous slides, I mentioned it's this rotate by 13 or ROT13 cipher. And that's sort of a very basic cipher, right? So it's not really any sort of serious security. So the question here was like, well, is this really a crime, or what's going on here? And under the US, it was. So there's a law, and we're going to come back to that later in the ethics part, or ethics lecture, known as the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, that just made circumventing electronic locks a crime. And so, and there was a lot of, basically issues around this, around did he even do it in the US? It was a crime in the US, but you would have to have, actually circumvented the locks there, potentially for it to apply. The charges were eventually dropped, so there was no, there was no specific case law around this, but it was a pretty good example of, this was a system where the actual security was very poor. Someone still got in trouble for breaking it because it was the act of breaking it itself that was kind of illegal here. If we jump forward another 12 years or so, we're now talking more about data breaches. So in the first sort of few examples, right? So in the in this case, the security mechanism was being broken to kind of steal some, or potentially steal some books or something like that, right? Because you could remove some of the security features that let you copy the PDFs and things like that. In 2013, we had something called a data breach. This is far from the first data breach, but it's at the time was kind of one of the larger ones, affected a very large company and a huge number of people. And basically, the objective of hackers was to steal credit card and account information from Target. And so what they wanted to do was basically use this for fraud. So you wanted to have credit cards that you could then, either sell the information about or directly steal stuff from that. And so there was some financial gain via credit card fraud. So that was the objective of these hackers. How they did it is they looked up public information on some of the suppliers. So the heating cooling system. So Target has huge buildings. They have refrigeration systems, obviously. So they're going to have vendors that manage all that for them. On the assumption that these vendors would be smaller and have poorer security, which was a pretty good guess, they attacked these vendors, which they could then use to get into Target. So this diagram here is from a paper that I've linked down here that has some more information. And basically what you had is the attacker was first, so you can see this one is sort of the order things are going in. They were attacking this HVAC supplier Phasio-Mechanical. So they compromised their systems. The Phasio-Mechanical systems would eventually be able to access the target network. Via the target network, right? So there's some like supplier portals and stuff like that you wouldn't have access to as a public person, but once you were a supplier, you had an additional level of trust, right? It wasn't full access to their systems at all, but through the Phasio-Mechanical systems, they got access to a new system. They found security flaws in that, and basically were able to keep proceeding. So keep finding security flaws in new systems that you now have access to. The eventual goal of all of this was collecting basically card information from the point of sale terminals. So the objective here was to get card information from the point of sale terminals. The other thing you have to remember is that just because you have the data doesn't mean you can actually get it out. If there's a very good security in place, it's going to stop someone from stealing data that is secure. So even if someone's in the network, how do you get it out of the network? So that was another potential place it could be stopped. In this case, it wasn't. So that data was able to move out of the network, out into eventually some sort of attacker controlled computer, which then they could read it out of. So this basically let them steal information about people shopping at Target. Who did this affect in the end? So this was about 40 million customers were affected. Target claims this cost them a total of $200 million. So they were, as part of that, they were fined. So, the question is, was it a case of they had the correct security in place? Obviously the leak happened, so it suggests they did not. And they settled, so they paid close to $20 million to settle a number of claims, in the US anyway, in 2017. So there was some negative results for them out of that. And a few people, so I don't know if they actually caught the exact people perpetrating the full attack. There was a number of people that were, helped develop software or were somehow suspected of being connected to this. So these three names here come from this Washington Post article for reference. The first one was actually prosecuted. The other two I don't know. One of them was just wasn't in the U.S. at all, so that wasn't going to happen, I think, as far as I know. So that Target breach is definitely not the first, and it's not the largest. It's one, though, that's interesting because it used another network to come in, so the Phasio-Mechanical. So it was a relatively advanced attack, right? They're not just scanning any network looking for something that's totally insecure. The Target system, is relatively good. It's a big company, so they obviously had some effort put into this. And this happened in 2013. So it's not like this was the beginning of information security, right? So they could have known better. If you're curious on both ends, right, what's the biggest and what was the first? So there's this Wikipedia list of data breaches that I linked to. And if you look at the biggest in terms of just records, so this isn't monetary loss or anything like that, what you have is there's about 3 billion. So there's actually a few kind of different records here that have affected stuff. So there's ones like number of photo obtained. So that's kind of a little, it's a little hokey on counting it. But the rest of them are pretty, legitimate. So Yahoo had like 3 billion accounts compromised. A number of others are down there in the high 100 million range in terms of accounts compromised. Some of them multiple, so you see Yahoo's on that list twice, for example. So these data breaches are a continuous part of life, unfortunately. This is one of the main reasons. So when we talk about computer security, you're told, not to reuse passwords across networks and stuff like that because of these data breaches. Because these data breaches include different stuff. A very common attack target is usernames and passwords. In terms of the first, if we go back to 2004, this list only includes with more than 30,000 records taken. There's a lot of like smaller vendors and smaller companies that won't make that threshold, or there's some that may be totally unknown, so they also wouldn't be in this list. But you can see that, you know, the 2004 and onward is where we start getting into serious data breaches. So AOL had like 92 million records lost, and it sort of goes onward from there from 2004. So you can see that, you know, some of these data breaches are somewhat more recent. You know, in the past, 16 years. It's become a thing compared to the earlier information security, which wasn't typically just dumping tons of records from people. And if you wonder why that is, what you can sort of think about, right, is if you look back to some of these earlier attacks, like even, you know, this late 1980s, right, there weren't really enough users that made sense to get into data breaches. We're now at the point that there's so many different websites, so many different users on them. There can be a lot of value in these types of breaches. All right, so let's jump to another example. So the final example I'm going to use here is Stuxnet. So this was 2010, or it sort of happened in 2010. It's come out slowly over, you know, the last 10 years. I think quite a few details, most details of it now are known. This one's really interesting because at the time, and it probably still is, one of the largest sort of sponsored cyber attacks, one of the most complicated cyber attacks, or cyber physical attack, really. So physical because it affected physical systems. What you have here in the photo at the right is these devices, and this is a centrifuge. These centrifuges are used as part of a uranium enrichment. So they're used in a nuclear program. And you basically have your separating forms of uranium gas, and we're separating a heavier form that's more useful from a lighter form. And so the centrifuges spin very quickly to do that separation. And you can see there's just rows. So there's this centrifuge hall that just has rows and rows and rows of centrifuges, and we have the Iranian leader touring this nice facility. These centrifuges are controlled by a device here. So this is a common industrial device, and we'll talk more about industrial control systems in another lecture. This device is a programmable logic controller, or PLC. It controls a number of these centrifuges. This attack had the objective of setting back the Iranian atomic program. So this was actually an attack that was sponsored by other nations with the objective of harming the national Iranian atomic program. So this is a little different, right, than what we talked about in other ones where we had a direct financial incentive. Here that the hackers actually have some military incentives for this work. So this is an extremely interesting attack to dig into. There's a book written about it, right? So there's this Countdown to Zero Day book that's quite good. There's some rather long articles and a rather long Wikipedia article if you don't want to quite commit to a book. It's really a good historic, now historic, I guess I'll say, but a good lesson in advanced cyber attacks that is probably going to remain one of the most complicated for some time to come. And really briefly, what happened is a worm was developed, so a computer virus, computer malware was developed, but it was very, very specific in what it was looking for. So it basically looked for an exact configuration of this PLC that suggested it was running in the network, the Iranian network that it's looking for. And if it found that configuration, it basically overwrote some of the control logic for it that caused it to occasionally, like once every 28 days or something, speed up too fast such that it would likely damage itself, right? These are very, very sensitive devices here that have, they're spinning very quickly. They have a lot of bearings in them that if they go too fast, then it's going to cause damage to them internally. So it's going to cause mechanical damage. So the objective of the attack was to do mechanical damage to the physical system. So it would occasionally spin too quickly. At the same time, it was reporting back that everything was normal. So to the user, it wasn't tripping alarms, but the devices would slowly get damaged. And it did cause, so basically part of the original detection of the attack, because Iran isn't just going to come out and say, oh, by the way, you know, we're under an attack by a nation state. The reason it was detected originally was that some of the atomic energy inspectors, which had access to the outside of these facilities to observe them, noticed a larger than normal number of centrifuges being repaired and removed and replaced. So there's some suggestion that the failure rate was way higher than it should be. And so then eventually more and more details came out as this Stuxnet worm leaked out into the world or the wider web, so it could be analyzed and understood and things like that. So we've slowly learned more about it, but it's basically a quite complicated, quite interesting attack. It also raises a really important term, something called a 0 day. So a 0 day is a previously unknown exploit. This is a vulnerability that has not been seen before, and normally it means there's no protection. So a 0 day in Windows means that Microsoft does not know about this bug. If it's used by a worm or something, they have not had time to release a patch to fix it. Nobody has protection against it. So they're incredibly powerful. And they're relatively valuable. As soon as they're used, right, they become known. Because once we know a 0 day, once you analyze how it works, you can protect against it. So Stuxnet actually had 4 of these 0 days. So they had a huge number of 0 days. And this is part of how it was initially, you know, besides how complicated the logic was, it was assumed to be sort of state-sponsored because there were so many of these 0 day operations in it. Or 0 day exploits in it, sorry. So that's another term that we're going to come up with again and again. All right, so that's 5 examples of failures that I've tried to cover in a reasonable time. What can you get out of it, right? Besides the fact that obviously things can fail, there's exploits, there's people that are looking for those exploits. There's a few sort of really high-level summaries to take out of that, and both of them are what are the attackers' objectives and capabilities, right? So when you're looking at these attacks, one thing to consider is, are they looking for, it could just be fame. So there's attacks where there is no monetary reason to do this, right? There's just people that have a hacker tag or something that they're trying to promote. And they're just doing it for fame to be kind of this famous hacker. Money is a really common one, right? And more common now, especially with some of these larger attacks. So this money might be part of a fraud, right? So we have money where, you could just be directly trying to steal money from a bank account, but often it's like credit card fraud or something like that, that is trying to be achieved via the attacks. If it's a military objective, right, that's different typically from all of the above because they have some exact specific objective they want to achieve for a military purpose. The final thing that you'll commonly see is potential for revenge. So this could be, if it's just personal people, it could be revenge on a business. So there's another objective here that's a little different, again, because it's not necessarily trying to, extract any useful information, but maybe just destroy something. So you can sort of see, like some of these have differences in whether they're trying to just destroy or whether they're trying to extract information. A more recent one that, still achieves money even without stealing all the information is, of course, the idea of locking. So these crypto locker attacks where people put malware on networks, shut down the network, typically encrypt a bunch of information and say, unless you pay us X, dollars, and normally X is like $1 million+ dollars, we're just going to destroy your information. So it relies on people not having backups or the backups also getting corrupted or the hackers actually attack the backups. So actually recently, I don't have it in the slides, but Garmin was hit with a large cyber attack last month, I think, that shut down a huge amount of their networks, and it was assumed to be, so there's still information coming out, some sort of malware-based attack like this. The other question is, what resources does the attacker have? And this is technical resources, right? So do they have high capabilities available to them, right? So it might be that they have funding, but they don't actually have a network of people that they can rely on, or trusted people that have technical resources. More common, I think, is that they have technical resources, so they're smart people. They don't have a huge amount of monetary funding to do the attack. And the other question is, who else can they work with, right? So do they have a network of other people to work with, that are going to give them resources or things like that. So those are just sort of some things to think about. If you look back on some of these failures, as you look back at other computer security failures, that can be important. But what we're going to look at next is what are the systems of interest to us. So we're actually interested in embedded systems. What does that mean, right? So an embedded system is typically a really special purpose computer. And when we looked at the previous computer security failures, there's a range of systems. A lot of them were just classic computer security. This course is all about embedded systems. So the next lecture is going to actually be what are embedded systems, not from a cybersecurity perspective, just from a general definition. So after that, we'll then start to dig into a few examples of embedded systems in terms of automotive, Internet of Things, and industrial as sort of three areas where we have embedded systems, and they all have a bit of unique perspectives. So hopefully you enjoyed a bit of an introduction to what computer security is, and check out the next one for more information on what embedded systems are.